Right guys, I'm going to show you how I focus stacked this image, taking into consideration the 4 key aspects of doing a successful focus stack with the correct aperture selection, the right shutter speed, going into the focus racking method using focus peaking in my camera, and then how many images do you actually need to do a focus stack successfully. Then I'm going to jump into Photoshop, I'm going to put it all together, so let's get into it. So when you're doing focus stacking, you really want to pick the right aperture, and the right aperture for focus stacking is going to be around f11, and it's kind of like that sweet spot of having that optical sharpness within your lens and also a really good depth of field. Where if you're shooting at say f5.6, you're going to have a much shallower depth of field from your point of focus towards your lens and from your point of focus beyond. So you might actually need to do more frames to get that depth of focus range within your whole shot. But if you're thinking about shooting at f16 or f22 to increase your depth of field, just remember that the furthest you move away from the sharpest point of your lens, you can actually introduce diffusion into your image, which is a breakdown of image quality. So when you're doing a focus stack, you want to have the sharpest possible image you can, but also at the same time having a really good depth of field so you get the range of images for the blending later on in Photoshop. So when it comes down to selecting the right shutter speed, it really is subject to the scene that you're shooting. For where I'm at, I've got the waterfall coming down, and because the water's crashing down, it creates a lot of circular air movement in the area, so the fern's ever so slightly moving. So for me, that sort of defeats the purpose if I'm going to have a slower shutter speed for the waterfall, but as a trade-off, my fern's actually moving and I've got motion blur in the foreground, because the whole purpose of focus stacking is so everything looks nice and sharp from the start of the frame all the way through. So for this shot, I picked 1/4 of a second. It froze the ferns in the foreground. It gave me that nice sort of silky water in the background, and also froze the motion around the waterfall itself with the other sort of ferns and vegetation that was there. So if you're doing these sort of scenes, pick a shutter speed that works for you, but then take a few test shots and look around your image to make sure that the shutter speed is actually capturing everything nice and sharp. So when focusing in your scene, I choose to use the focus peaking feature in my Sony, purely for the fact that I wanted to be able to shoot my frames really quickly. Because I got the fern ever so slightly moving, I wanted to reduce the amount of time in between taking each shot. So if I was actually just using my manual focus point and guiding it in my image where I wanted to focus, take the shot, move it, focus, take the shot, it would have taken a lot of time, and in between that time my fern's moving more and more, and it's going to cause far more problems later on in Photoshop when I actually ask it to do the focus stacking for me. But if you have a scene where you don't actually have that sort of problem, then doing the manual method would work fine. Or just try use your focus peaking, because it's a really good system. It shows you exactly on the contrast edges what is and isn't in focus, and you just use that method, and it's really quite simple and easy. So when it comes to how many images does it take to focus stack, it really does come down to the subject you're shooting and how close you are to it, as you might need maybe 2 or 3 images for the foreground and then 2 for the midground into the background there. Just keep in mind that when you watch a tutorial and someone says this is a 3-image focus stack, they're absolutely correct. They use 3 images to make that focus stack, just as I did. In this example, I used 3 images to do my focus stack, but I actually took 6 images as part of the shooting sequence for it. And all I did is I chose the best 3 to give me the best final result. So always overshoot your focus stack scene, because when you come back into Photoshop, you can't just sort of nip out and grab those extra shots that you didn't take when you're out there. When you're out and on this scene, that's your prime opportunity to get absolutely everything you need. So when you're back in Photoshop, you've got the best possible opportunity to get the focus stack and the final result that you want. Okay, so here the files are in Adobe Camera Raw. And if we could just come through and have just a quick look. So the foreground here, it looks okay, but it's not great. So that's my first shot. I come into my next one and I have a look. And when it loads in, you can see how I've got that really nice sharpness, certainly through all the ferns. So that's an ideal sort of perfect foreground image. Then as we come through with the different sort of frames, these are going to be more ideal for the background, obviously. So if we look through here, when it loads in, we're going to have nice sharpness all through the ferns, all through the background, and everything's nice and crisp. Probably even the last one might even be even better. Yeah, so that's much sharper. So that's going to be absolutely perfect. And all I've done is I've come through and I've synchronized my settings. I've set my white balance to be the same with all images. I've just come through and just done some basically global editing. So once they're all done, you just basically select them all and open them up into Photoshop. Okay, so once all your frames are opened up in Photoshop, you want to stack them so they're all in one layer. So you're going to come in File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, add Open Files, click OK, and it's going to load them all over on the right hand side into your layer palette, and you're going to have all of them stacked on one top of each other. So there they are. Now all I do is I come in and I basically close all the other files because this is just taking up unnecessary RAM on my computer. Okay, so once all your files are loaded into stacks here, what I like to do is my top image is actually my foreground, and I don't really want that. I actually want the bottom of it, so when it does it, actually we go through and we focus stack this image. I want to have my foreground at the bottom. It doesn't really change how it focus stacks, but I just like to have it in that sort of sequential order. So I just basically drag and drop them in the order that they're going to need to be. Okay, so once that's done, I'm going to hit Shift and on the top image and then the bottom image. I'm going to come over to Edit, Auto Align Layers, click OK. The reason why you want to auto align layers is as you click through each image, you'll see it slightly move, even though you're on a tripod, and that's due to basically, because you're changing your point of focus, it's called focus breathing. So as you go around and move your focus point through your image, it actually sort of ever so slightly changes your image. So you want to actually run the auto align on your files first. Okay, so it's auto align the files for us. So if you just come through and just have a look, you can see how the image is slowly changing in between each frame. If we look in the foreground here, you can see definitely out of focus compared to our foreground shots where it's actually nice and sharp. So to focus stack this now with them all selected, we come in Edit, Auto Blend Layers, Stack Images is ticked, and Seamless Tones and Colors is ticked. Click OK. Okay, so our focus stack is done. I'm just going to zoom out. As you can see here on the right hand side, you can see the masks that made up this focus stack. So the top image is my shot for the background. So if we have a look at that, hold down the Alt key, click on your mask. You can see how it's used parts of the outside here. So white will reveal, black will conceal. So it's detected that it thinks that some of the foreground elements are sharp enough to be in the foreground when actually it's a background image that we've shot. So then as we come through, you can see the different masks that have been used. So not really much of this frame has been used at all. Coming through to this image, so we're starting to have our focus point much closer to us, so it's starting to put more white in the foreground. This image there, that image there, and then our really up close one is only basically using that little tiny part of the fern and a little bit on the right hand side here. So overall, when we come in and have a close inspection, you can see how I've got the fuzziness here on the edge of the ferns here, which is not great at all. And then as we come around, you can see that part of the ferns have this funny glow to it. And this is purely why I focus racked my image using the peaking, is because I just wanted to reduce that movement within the ferns. And that's what you're seeing here. And for some reason, Photoshop has detected that these parts of the tips of the ferns are sharp enough to be used for the focus stack to say, this is the foreground. So this is the biggest problem that I've had with focus stacking this image. So that's what it's like using 6 images to focus stack with. So what you do now is you go through and you review each one of these images and see which 3 or 4 give you the best range within your images, and then you restack them, and then you try and problem solve any issues that you have within your image. So I'm going to come in, I'm just going to delete the masks off all these files. So now I'm ready to basically start from scratch. So I don't want this image here, 384, that's not going to be doing me any good. So then I'm going to come through, I'm just going to come in and just see if that image there is really good, which is better. So obviously that's really good, so I'm going to get rid of that one. Then just going to come through and just sort of see where I get the best sort of depth of field blend within my shot. Going to look in the foreground. So that's a better shot there. So I'm going to get rid of this one. So now I've refined it down to 3 images. So I'm going to come in, hold my Shift key, select those 3, come into Edit, auto blend layers again, and focus stack it for the second time after I've done the cull of seeing which images do and don't work for this focus stack. Okay, so now our focus stack is done. We can look through and we've got a much better transition with our images. We still have these problems with the tips of the ferns, but everywhere else looks really good as it's come through and it's done the focus stack. So now the problem that I have is I have to try and get rid of these blurred out fern tips because the rest of the shot looks really good. But one thing I do first, before I start messing around, is you can see that I've got these transparent borders here, and I want to make sure that my image is correctly cropped for this shot. So I'm going to come in, see with my crop tool. I'm going to change my aspect ratio from 3 to 2. Don't ever get in the habit of just randomly cropping your image. This is shot as a 3 to 2 ratio photo, so you always have to keep it 3 to 2. And the good reason why you want to crop it now is you don't want to try and fix areas that have errors when they're not actually going to be part of your crop. So I come in and I just basically crop my image the way I finally want it. Just come down, just get it how you want, double click, and now you're ready to work on what's going to be your master print file, and you know the errors that you got in your image that need to be fixed now, and you're not going to waste any time trying to fix problems that you then crop out when you do the final sort of cropping before you do your edit. So what I'm going to jump now into my final image that I did when I focus stacked this and walk you through how I fix these errors with the ferns. Okay, so this is my final edited focus stack shot here. So if we come in, zoom in, you can see that I've fixed all the edges and all the fuzziness that we had within the shot. So as you look through, we've got really nice depth of field all the way through the image with the ferns and all the way through to the background here. So what I've done is I've basically come into this image and I just realized that, if I turn the mask off, that this foreground really isn't ideal at all with the mask that it's selected. It's not good and it doesn't really do a good job at all. As you can see, it's cut off the tips of the ferns here, and that's where my problems start to come into this image. So what I've done is I've basically come in and I've just deleted that mask and said, I don't want you. I've then come down, I've made a selective color layer. I've come into the mask color range, and I'm now going to cut out the ferns using the selective color masking, selecting the greens and then refining the fuzziness. So then I've clicked OK. I've then alt clicked on my mask, B for my brush tool, and I've come in and I've painted out all the white, because white will reveal, black will conceal. So I don't want to have any white in the image showing through, because I want to basically make a really refined mask to cut out the fern. So once I've done that process, I basically applied that to this layer. So come in, I command click onto that basically adjustment layer, I click on this one and I basically hit the mask icon and it cuts it out for me. I turn that selective color layer on, I turn my other two on, and what I've done is I've basically come up and I've put that onto the top layer there. So basically now this is the primary layer. Obviously it doesn't look that great because I didn't really finish up the selection there. And then what I've done is I've basically removed both these images, the masks on them. I've deselected that, I've selected both of them, and I've come back in and I've re-auto blended those two layers and clicked OK. Now with those two layers selected, I've gone Command Option Shift E and merged two visible layers into the top layer. Now I turn this layer back on, and with the bottom layer, the layer underneath selected, I've come in, and now I've just come in, I've basically cloned out using sampled parts of this image to fix all the weird edges into this shot. So let's jump into that image that I've finally edited. I come into my focus stack, and this is the process that I've done that I just explained. So I can just come through and I'll just show you the refined mask that I ended up with. So I've come through and I've just selected and painted out all the parts that I've needed for that, and I've applied it to this mask up the top here, which was my foreground layer. And then I've basically come through and I've cleaned up all the edges. So if I turn this layer off, you can actually see all the parts that I've edited out of the fern with the underground layer and basically blended it all in for that result there. And unfortunately, I find that focus stacking is one of those things that when you got a shot like this, it really does come down to being almost like a labor of love to finally get the result. And the thing is that you have all the images you need to do it. You just got to find a way that you can actually focus stack it and get the final result that you want. So after doing all that hard work, basically this is my final edit of what the shot looked like. I came through and basically all my editing layers are basically here. I had to flatten it because it was over like 4 gig and it just wouldn't save properly. But all I've really done, I've done basically selective dodge and burning. I've decontrasted up the top here. I've done basically a layer with a soft light set with a very light green and just dabbed it in there slightly. I've done some decontrasting of shadow areas. So I've just come in, I've used a brightness and contrast adjustment layer, reduced the contrast all the way down, and then I've come in and I've selected like a darks 2 mask or a darks 1 mask, and I've applied that to that layer there, so it only is targeting shadow areas. So I come in, I've selected like a darks 2, and I've applied it to that adjustment layer. So then you can sort of see here where it's sort of applied it, and then you just sort of refine it down to where you want to target it even further. So if I get rid of that, and then what I've done is I've basically just done a local area contrast adjustment just to give it a bit more of that contrast on the edges. I've come in with a Gaussian blur layer, and I usually set a Gaussian blur layer to target just the highlights, but I found it really didn't do too much, so I've just done it globally on there. And then right at the end, I've just sort of seen how this sort of area here is just probably a little bit too bright. So again, I've come in with basically a dodge and burn layer and just burnt in with a very, very sort of like lighter mid-range sort of brown, and I've just come through and I've just painted that through a little bit, and it's just basically given that final result. And in the end, it comes up really good. It looks really nice. There's a nice sort of glow to the ferns. I've got all that sharp detail. I've got that nice sort of glowy look up in the waterfall when it's coming down. And overall, spending that extra time messing around with the foreground, fixing up that focus stack issue that I had was well worth it, because the final result looks really, really nice, and I'm really happy with how it finally turned out. So as you can see, really nice final result, and it comes down to those 4 principles, making sure you've got the best aperture to shoot your focus stack at, and for me it's f11, so I got that really good depth of field in between each frame from my focus point. Next is your shutter speed. Make sure you got a shutter speed that's going to freeze the movement in your scene, also in the foreground, but definitely in the background as well is a really good consideration. Next is your focus racking method. So as you see, I use the focus peaking within my camera, and if you've got these sort of features, it's might as well use them because they're really good. And I just find the manual focusing method too cumbersome and it's really slow. So the last one is basically how many images do you need for your focus stack, and as you saw, I used 3 images for this, but always overshoot the amount of images you need for a focus stack. As you saw, I dropped certain images out. The foreground, the very first shot that I took, gone. I used a second image, but if that first image was the one that I only shot, then I would have had problems and I wouldn't have had that really nice crisp sharpness in the image to start with. If you'd like to see more tutorials like this, guys, I've got them on my channel. So give us a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.